All right, so it's Wednesday. What is it, April 15th?
April 15th, day 23.
Day 23, and we are so lucky to have with us Matthew Kay, who wrote Not Light But Fire. And one thing I want to say about this book, I purchased it when it first came out, probably mostly because of the title. I love James Baldwin. I was like, what is this? And then it was probably less than a week later, I get this message from Kelly, and he says, have you heard of this book? And it's a picture of your book. This guy writes like a dream. His first chapter will knock you out. And I was like, oh, so I think both of us found in this book, not only the voice of a teacher and an incredibly, incredibly thoughtful writer, like your sentences just sing. But for me, you answered questions that I needed to have answered about how to have difficult race conversations in my classroom. So I'm just so excited you agreed to talk with us today and that you can help teachers think about these questions.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So as I said right before we came on, Matthew, I really, really, really love your book. Can you say a little bit about this, this conversation about, how to move from sort of inconsequential conversations or surface level conversations about race in ways that you have kind of shaped in your own classroom so that it's a much more meaningful experience for kids?
I think it's pretty complex, but I think the thing that's most important to me is that there's something about the race conversation that we have that sticks. I think so much of our race conversations with students tends to just kind of wash over them. And, not because we don't, mean well and things like that, but it's just like they kind of enter and exit a February, learning a couple names and moving on to the next thing. And they don't find the applications to their life, or they don't find places to plug into what I think is some pretty relevant stuff. And so I just want, and I just also think on a larger scale, our country has a habit of kind of show conversations about race. And I kind of, that's a tough legacy to stop, but I want to be part of the interruption of that. I want folks to be in the habit of, like, after we have these race conversations, something about our world is different, or something about our families are different, or something about our neighborhood is different. And to kind of hold that as a standard.
So could you say more about show conversations and how you pivot away from those?
Well, I think with some conversations, there's many ways I think that a conversation can be a show conversation. But one of them might be, like, sometimes very well-meaning teachers might, for instance, have a moment where they'll have an activity where, like, students cry or something. They engage some sort of emotion and it makes them very upset and they cry. And because Hollywood tells them that that's a victory, they feel like something has happened. Where in fact, all you did was, like, re-traumatize them for a day and not do much. And so I wanted to kind of raise the standard about, like, what is a meaningful engagement with these ideas, and what's something that just kind of, like, sort of superficially picks at an emotion or that kind of stuff. That's just one example. There's lots of other showy things that happen, but I think among teachers of goodwill, one of the models that's there for us, unfortunately, is this idea that if the kids are somehow upset after our lesson, then we've done a good job. I think that is considerably more complicated than that. And so I just wanted to push teachers to be aware of those kind of moments.
Sorry, I think one of the complications has always been, for me, I'm a white person trying to have a conversation that I'm uncomfortable with. I'm afraid that it will go places, that kids will be disrespectful, that, the school I taught in always had a small number of kids of color. And in trying to kind of go overboard in protecting them, not being able to have a good conversation, one of the things I used from your book was that idea of how you take a word like ghetto and you break it into these parts. Who uses it? How is it used? When is it used? What are the contexts? And having kids generate this whole flood of questions around the word, which was a stepping stone I needed to then have the N-word conversation, which is a different chapter. And I didn't reach the expertise, obviously, that you have, but it sure made it a better conversation in my class because I had your guide.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think one thing that I tell teachers often is, when I work with them, colleagues, because I'm still teaching, and I will be, until I'm done with my career. Is that sometimes, again, to go back to this Hollywood idea, is that we are supposed to kind of close our door and be like super iconoclastic, like we're, like close the door and be a rebel, that kind of model. And for me, I think that's not sustainable. And I think whereas a lot of the state standards and Common Core standards and all the stuff that our administrators want to see, a lot of that is not, it can also be a part of, and often it is a part of good teaching. Like a lot of the things that I have to do as far as like unpacking a word, like what you're describing, like there are about 5 or 6 Pennsylvania state standards that I'm hitting right there when I do that activity. And so if I take this rebel approach where I'm just going to like close the door and proselytize my politics onto my kids, it's not, I might not actually be teaching them. I might, who knows? I don't want to speak in absolutes, but the activities like what you're describing, they're actually backed up by some of the people that we instinctively buck against. And when teachers talk about how do they justify in communities that may be more conservative or communities that most, like how do you justify some of these race conversations? One of the first things I say is it's just plain good teaching. Link everything you do. Stop trying to close your door and do things in secret. You should, everything we do, everything I talk about in that book, all those things, they can very easily be aligned to Common Core stuff. They can very easily
pop in.
Yeah, it's like that guy on the news broadcast whose kid came in. That's what it's like. Stop trying to hide it, because a lot of the stuff that's actually good teaching, your test scores will also go up. Like there are a lot of things that my wife is the only project-based teacher, the only conversation-based teacher, student-centered teacher in her group of colleagues, and she has the best test scores. Like it's also just good teaching. So yeah.
It absolutely is, especially that moment when the principal walks in your room in the book.
Yeah.
And then he sits down and stays, because what you're doing is so powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was scary.
No kidding.
So
that was
Mac,
my first year.
Can you talk a little bit about how you build a conversation-based classroom in a way that lends kids the kind of thinking you want them to do?
I think there's a few steps to that that I try to hit on chapter 1. Mostly, if I had to focus on 2 different things, which is what I normally do, it's creating a culture that values listening, like authentically, and the second one is creating a environment that has a lot of house talk. I call them house talk relationships. I think those 2 things combined make it a space where, I call it an ecosystem where like these race conversations can thrive and not just be, lucky accidents, but they can actually be purposeful. If you have them focus on listening and build listening skills and have grading systems that value listening skills and all that kind of stuff. And also if you purposely work on the relationships in your classroom, not just by saying things like this is a safe space or saying things like we can be friends together, but actually working to build those relationships through allotting your class time for them. Because kids aren't dumb. They know what you value, and they know that because of what you spend your time on. So I think those 2 things are a start at least.
So you're teaching how many classes a day?
It varies. This year, I have 2 sections of ninth grade, 2 sections of 10th grade, and I taught a race theory elective this year. I normally teach an elective. Um, and I'm athletic director. I'm an assistant athletic director and boys basketball coach and football coach. So
You don't
Is that
have
all?
anything to do.
That's all you're doing?
yeah, that's all.
So,
I'm slacking a little bit.
no, the reason I was asking was you have to have those moments when some of the classes are going really well and some of them just are not becoming that ecosystem you desire.
Yeah, definitely.
And what are some ways that you found that you can take a class that is either not listening well to each other or just not gelled with you? How do you move them into those hard conversations? What are the things you try?
Well, the good thing is if you make the focus on it, like on building the relationships and on listening, I'll say the first, like this year, my 10th graders, spot on. We had so many interruptions this year, pre-COVID, like right now. We had asbestos problems in our school. Our kids maybe had a month of uninterrupted school all year. They were out all the time. They were in ancillary buildings. They were like, we had all sorts of stuff pre this. So they've had like the year from hell. So the freshmen really, I got to see what it was like when all of that stuff was interrupted. And I actually could see the difference this year. When you don't have that constant, we don't have literally the time to do the constant daily, like relationship building as purposeful, and the focus on the listening skills. They are not good listeners. And so they're getting there, but then we got more interruptions. So part of my adjustment for next year is going to be realizing that my ninth graders and most ninth graders, like everywhere, did not get what they needed to get this year, and to be patient with them as far as their people skills. But I think the good thing is I can always lean back on the curriculum stuff when those things, like, you have to build the ecosystem, but that doesn't change how I make my discussion prompts and how all the stuff in chapter 3, having having a really solid chapter 1 stuff does not get in the way of me doing chapter 3 stuff. Like, I still have to be thoughtful about my curriculum. I still am trying to thread the conversation so they build. I'm still trying to use race as a lens thoughtfully. I'm still trying to, like, all those things. So even when they're not up to my standard, they're not like, I still think I'm being meaningful, which is my goal. Yeah. They're just not up where they need to be.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit, okay, you have this curriculum that's sitting there, but how you approach that curriculum using race as a lens?
Well, I wish I could make it more complex so I sound smarter, but it's basically just looking at it like a lens. For instance, I use, I don't think I put this example in the book, but I teach Lord of the Flies, and that's a very considerably white book. There are no brown people anywhere close to Lord of the Flies. But when you apply that lens, the lens of race, when you apply the lens of race, it's actually races everywhere. Like, William Golding in that book, as the boys, become more and more savage, what he uses to show their fall into savagery is having them behave more and more like indigenous people. They like stereotypes of indigenous people. They do rain dances and they wear face paint and they do all these kind of things, which says a lot. The fact that Golding used that as a tool to show their descent into savagery is a very Eurocentric, like, this is what this means. And for the kids, it's wide open. Once you apply that lens, there's 30,000 conversations that you can have with, like, this moral, the subjective way that we decide what civilized is and what it isn't, which complicates the thesis a little bit, and the kids can have fun. So it's just really trying to figure out where is race in this book. And what I tell colleagues I'm working with is, it may not be in every book, but it's in considerably more books than we think so. Like, it may not be everywhere. Like, you may not be inserting race into 2+2. But that doesn't mean, but it's in more places than you think. if you just apply the lens, or at least I've discovered that.
Mhm.
Like it doesn't have to have a brown author to have a race lens.
So have you replaced texts in your curriculum with other texts, or moved to book clubs to bring in some other texts? What have you done with like the basic curriculum?
I have, well, I'm fortunate at SLA because I don't have a base curriculum. I've had to create. I'm blessed to be able to create my deal. So I want to, own my privilege there. Now that said, I've come into the school, and I had one thing I do have is the constraints that most people have around budget and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Like, if we have a class set of books, that's what I'm teaching. Like, unless I'm going to talk to all my cousins and friends to have them do a GoFundMe to get me new books, which is so there's some adjustments I need to make, which is why the lens stuff is so important.
Mhm. Mhm.
An interesting problem though is like sometimes we overcompensate. Like, I've had a few students who, like, I noticed maybe 2 years ago that I had too much slavery in my curriculum. I didn't even realize. Like, I didn't realize that, but I realized that these kids were taking African American history and my class, and thought we were doing a good thing by like linking everything up and everything. And it turned out that I was unintentionally doing something I talk about in the book often, where I'm like narrowing and flattening our own experience, just because they were reading 3 books about slavery in 1 year. And I didn't realize that until kids were like, "Oh," I handed it out, and I was like doing my book talk thing, and the kids were like, "Oh," and I'm like, "Oh, wait, what?" I thought this was exciting, and they're like, "No." I'm like, "This is different. This is Octavia Butler, Kindred. It's sci-fi." They're like, "Yeah, but slavery though." I'm like, "Oh." You also did read 2 other books about it.
Yeah.
And so how do you pivot from that? What do you do differently?
Well, I mean, 2 years ago, I just taught the book, and then realized afterwards that the next year I would have to make changes.
Mhm.
What I did do more real time, because we weren't in a place to sub things out because of budget reasons. I didn't have any other books. So every time I change something, I have to fundraise the money myself to get it. That's what it's like in Philly right now. And so I wasn't in a position to switch until the next year. But what I did do is I modified the conversations. I said, okay, so we're not going to, I said, it's weird, but we're going to read this book about enslavement, but most of our conversations, I'm going to kind of remove the historical lens. Like, we're not going to use it as much. We're going to talk about more of the relationships in this book and issues of power and stuff like that. But we're just kind of, stop. We're not going to look at primary source slave narratives. We're not going to do that kind of stuff because they've already in history class engaged that.
Yeah.
And so make sure I'm not unintentionally flattening out brown people experiences.
So can you talk a little bit kind of nuts and boltsy? Like, I know there's examples in the book, but ways in which you foster like a move or two that you make as a teacher that gets kids into a house talk environment and willingness.
Sure. I'll do the 2 that I stole from Zach Chase, just so I can shout him out some more. The good news. We start off every week with just sharing something that's good that's going on in the kids' lives. And what I say about that is, 1, you get to work on your discussion skills and your, projecting your voice and all those kind of things. But also it gives them the opportunity to engage each other, and most importantly me, because they saw each other before they got to my class, but to engage me as people before they engage me as students. And so I get to learn if they won their soccer game, or they had a bar mitzvah, or they are about to start Ramadan holiday stuff, or they're about to, like, they get to share these kind of things with me and with everybody else. So I get to know them more systemically, than just kind of like randomly in the hallway and stuff like that. They know before I even do any quote unquote teaching, we're going to engage.
And do you go around and ask every kid, or is it voluntary?
It's voluntary. I say, who's got good news? And they stand up. I actually did good news yesterday in my virtual class. And I thought, like, we're in the middle of a pandemic. There's no way. And that was like 20 minutes of class. The kids are like, I beat this video game. I did this. And the kids, like, it gets to a routine where if I skip it for some reason, they are upset. They are very upset. Like they become, and you realize that a lot of kids, because part of good news, they say it's my birthday. And so we sing happy birthday to them and stuff like that. And I'm all silly and I give them all like an original version of happy birthday and stuff. But then I realize I don't want to take for granted that kids have someone to sing happy birthday to them, or that like they have someone, like they have a hunger to share good news that the older I get, the more I realize they might not have someone else to tell. And so I try to, it serves a larger purpose than intended. Second is high grade compliments. We give the kids a chance to share something that they appreciate from a classmate. And it's like, I like that you helped me with this. I like your personality. I like that you're always encouraging me, all of those things.
Sounds like a place I'd want to be.
Well,
so I try to make class stink less. You know, like I try to make it stink a little less. I'm not saying it don't stink sometimes, but I try to. But what I do say is, like, I'm a coach, and any coach or sports fan knows about garbage time. And like, the players that play in garbage time know that they're only playing in garbage time because they're not good enough to play during like the real game. Mm-hmm. And so if we save all of our interpersonal stuff with kids for garbage time, like in the hallway or like the end of class or like right before a holiday or something like that, then they like, they associate, they don't internalize maybe this teacher doesn't like me, but they think that this teacher doesn't value that part of me as much as me, the student.
Yeah.
Which is cool because that's normal. But the problem is if you then turn around and ask them to be vulnerable, like if you turn around and ask them to like share how they feel of getting kicked out of their house because of gentrification or something, they're like, whoa, you don't know me like that. You don't even know if I've won my soccer game. Like, why would I get vulnerable with you if you don't even know that it was just my birthday? Like, mm-hmm. Which is fair and healthy. And I worry sometimes about kids who would overshare if they don't have a good relationship with the teacher. It might not even be a healthy thing to do.
That's something that Penny and I have talked a lot about. And that's this idea of how underappreciated I think teachers sometimes, like it took me late in my career to understand that personal connection with a kid was one of the most valuable things to establish if I want them to later come academic with me, you know.
Yeah.
So when you shoulder up with a writer or you share your own writing, share your own issues and problems with kids, just how powerful that is. And I was struck by that in your book, you know, how every Monday you would start with, you know, some sort of let's make this connections with one another. Because a class that's going to make those connections are then going to be able to have the way more difficult conversations, right?
And they start to cut each other some slack, which I think is most important. Like if you're dealing with rough stuff, kids are going to say, and I'm going to say, like dumb things. Like we're going to accidentally use the wrong pronoun. We're going to accidentally use the wrong phrase. We're going to accidentally, and if you're constantly, not just one time, but just like if you're constantly as a habit building relationships, then a kid might check me and say, Mr. K, you said that wrong. And I'll say, oh, my bad. Instead of Mr. K hates me. Like there's a difference. Yeah. It's like, I clearly don't hate you. Like we've had all these interactions. I had a dumb moment. Please help me. But it's also with their student, with their classmates. It's a little hard for them to knee jerk like this kid's racist. This kid's, and instead of this kid, ooh, yo, watch what you say, you this, and it doesn't get rid of all conflicts, but it buys you some time. It buys you more time than you would have had without doing it.
I love how nuanced that is, what you're talking about. That's really like, that's the teaching stuff that we don't explore enough. that all of that contributes to what you're ultimately after with these kids. It's fascinating. So right before we came on, Kelly and I were having this conversation about what are we going to learn from this distance learning that we were thrust into as a system, as an educational system. I've been in some conversations with people who believe we should blow everything up and start over, that we have an opportunity to imagine. What have you learned from being so disconnected from your kids suddenly and thrust into this new world?
I'm still learning. I think I'll be learning for a while. I was just telling my grad school students that I was like, if you like come out of this having learned a few things, like keep make something of this, in that sense. But I think I think first, I think there's a few tools that I'm having to engage now that I would not have engaged because they're just not part of my rhythm. They're not part of my game plan, play calling sheet in the real world. And so things like online discussion forums and stuff like that. Like I was just speaking with a colleague yesterday. I was asking her to help me explain it to kids because I don't use it because I depend so much on the stuff that you see in the book, like those kind of conversations, and I don't really pay that much attention to the online forums. And then I'm listening to her. I'm like, oh, that's neat. This is an opportunity that I was just completely, and now I have to. I can't afford to be dismissive because, Google Meets are really limiting as far as the conversations I'm trying to have. And there's so many interpersonal, like all the things that it's different when people are just a box on your computer. It's harder to you can't read facial expressions as well. You can't read body language. You can't read. And so these forums and all these other tools that I'm going to be exposed to probably will be applicable. Like I've already thought about ways that in September, October, I'll be bringing that into our regular deal.
Cool. Cool.
Well, I want to just say, Matt, that how much I love your book, and two things stood out. I mean, you said a lot today, but two things I'll close with is number one, you said very early in the conversation that you will be a teacher till the end of your career.
Yeah.
And I think that why people resonate with your book so much is they can tell it's written by somebody who is in the classroom, somebody who lives that life. There's an authenticity to it. And I think also I have an additional respect for you today in that you have modeled in this last half hour the real world balance of trying to be a dad and an educator at the same time. And I have to say, your poise under pressure is really impressive.
Right now, she's trying to pull the TV off the wall right now. That's what's currently happening. Get down.
That's why we need to make this end.
That's real. All right,
Hey,
Matt.
Final question. What are you reading right now?
I am reading, I'm a Civil War amateur buff. So I'm reading this book called In the Presence of Mine Enemies. I'm reading that. I'm reading, I finally ordered Stamped. So I'm reading Stamped.
Loved it.
I've read Stamped from the beginning. I've read How to Be Anti-Racist. I've read, I always tease, I always tease my friends and say, Dr. Kendi doesn't know it yet, but he's my new best friend. We just have to meet. As soon as we meet, then we're going to be best buds. So I read everything he touches. And then all sorts of pop candy fiction things in my iPod as I'm running or something like that.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time.
I think we got to let him go, Penny.
Absolutely. Thank you, Matt.
All right, Matt.
Real.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Bye.
See
Bye-bye.